It started like any other calm weekend morning. The kind where the lake breeze gently moves through the trees, and the only sounds are birds chirping and maybe a lawnmower somewhere in the distance. I was inside, making myself a second cup of coffee, when a sharp cracking noise broke the stillness. At first, I thought it was just a fallen branch or maybe someone doing yard work. But something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too loud, too intentional. I walked outside, mug in hand, only to be met with a scene that instantly boiled my blood. There she was, my neighbor from 2 doors down, who I'd only ever exchanged a few polite hellos with, standing on my back fence with a crowbar in one hand and a smug look on her face. One full section of my fence was already torn down and resting on the ground like a forgotten prop. Another panel was halfway pried loose. I blinked, thinking maybe this was some kind of mistake, but it was all too real. She didn't look startled or apologetic. She looked entitled. I stepped off my porch and asked her, "What exactly are you doing?" No yelling. Not yet. Just trying to figure out what universe I had woken up in. Without missing a beat, she replied, "Oh, I'm just opening a little path so I can walk down to the lake." Just like that. Like it was the most normal thing in the world to vandalize someone else's property because you feel like going for a swim. I stood there stunned for a second. She wasn't asking. She wasn't explaining. She was informing me of what she had already decided to do. I told her this was private property and that the fence was built there for a reason. Her response? Well, the lake's for the community. It's not fair that your yard is the only way to get there without walking all the way around. Apparently, convenience was her justification for trespassing and destroying my property in the process. The part that really got me was how casual she was about it, as if I was the one being unreasonable for wanting a fence to keep people out. She went on to say that she'd been living in the neighborhood longer than I had, and that everyone knows the lake access used to be open back here. According to her, the old fence that stood before I bought the property didn't block anyone, so she felt entitled to restore the original access. I wasn't sure what was more absurd, her argument or the fact that she was actively trying to back it up with vandalism. She pointed out into the yard and said, "See, it's just a straight shot down the slope. I've been walking this way for years. Nobody ever said anything." That was her justification. History, habit, entitlement disguised as tradition. The problem is, I had done my homework when I bought this place. I'd seen the surveys. I knew where my property line was. And more importantly, I had built that new fence exactly along that line, within legal bounds and with city permits. She was not only trespassing, she was now claiming historical rights to something that legally wasn't hers. At that point, she picked up her phone, muttering something about calling the HOA if I made a big deal about it, as if the HOA had any power over my land. But that gave me a clue. This wasn't just about her. Somewhere along the line, this shared access narrative had been floating through the neighborhood like an urban legend, and she was bold or foolish enough to act on it. The part that still blows my mind is how confidently she stood in the middle of my yard, tools in hand, acting like I was the intruder, like I was the one disrupting the natural order of things by putting up a fence on my own property. What she didn't know was that her little morning project was about to open up a much bigger story. Because when someone breaks your fence for lake access and expects you to thank them, that's not just a property dispute. That's a challenge. One I wasn't about to back down from. When I confronted her about breaking the fence, I expected an apology, maybe even some level of embarrassment. Instead, what I got was a full-blown justification that sounded like she had rehearsed it. She stood there on my property, hands on her hips, and said with a straight face, "It's shared community property. Everyone around here knows that." The level of confidence in her voice caught me off guard. She wasn't making a suggestion or asking for clarification. She was stating a belief, a very bold and very incorrect one. I told her, calmly at first, that the property she was standing on wasn't community land. It was mine, surveyed, documented, and purchased fair and square. She waved that off like it was just a minor technicality. "You can't really own the lake," she said, as if that settled everything. And that's when it became clear she didn't just think she had a right to walk through my land. She believed, deep down, that the entire lake was some sort of communal feature, and that ownership boundaries didn't apply to it. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a belief system, one rooted in vague stories passed around the neighborhood, probably reinforced over the years by a few shared fishing trips and casual strolls down to the water. I started asking around, quietly at first. Neighbors, a couple of longtime residents, even someone on the HOA board. And what I found was eye-opening. A surprising number of people in the neighborhood believed the same thing, that even though individual lots bordered the lake, the shoreline itself was technically community access. The phrase kept coming up, technically community. That word, technically, was doing a lot of heavy lifting. When I asked if they'd ever seen any legal documentation proving that, the answers suddenly became vague. Most just shrugged and said that's how it had always been. A few mentioned something about an old walking path that used to run along the lake years ago, before some of the newer homes were built. No one could point to an actual clause in the HOA bylaws, a city ordinance, or a property deed. It was all based on stories, assumptions, and nostalgia. The more I looked into it, the more I realized how this myth had been allowed to live on. It had become neighborhood gospel. And this woman, my fence-breaking neighbor, had taken it upon herself to enforce it. In her mind, I wasn't protecting private property. I was cutting off public access. That's how she saw it. And because no one had ever pushed back hard enough before, she assumed she could get away with it. What made it worse was the subtle pressure I started getting from other neighbors. Friendly smiles turned into cool nods. A few folks just happened to mention how nice it used to be when people could walk straight down to the lake from anywhere. One even told me, not so subtly, that maybe putting up a fence was a little aggressive. I began to see that this wasn't just about her. It was a deeply rooted neighborhood attitude, a kind of informal culture that believed in access over ownership, even when that access crossed legal lines. I even pulled out the survey I received when I bought the property, the one that clearly marked the boundaries. I highlighted the lot lines, the setbacks, everything. But no matter how clear it was, people like her didn't want facts. They wanted the past back, a past where no one enforced boundaries, where the lake was a free-for-all, and where fences were considered rude rather than necessary. The strangest part was how convinced she was that I was the unreasonable one, that I was the outlier. She honestly believed that I should move my fence or remove it altogether for the good of the community. That was the phrase she used, for the good of the community, as if I had some moral obligation to let people walk across my yard just because they always had. It wasn't just about property lines anymore. It was about principle, about how myths and entitlement can turn into actions that cross legal and ethical lines. She didn't sneak onto my land. She marched in with a tool in her hand and a belief in her heart. And when I challenged that belief, I became the bad guy in her eyes. Not because I was wrong, but because I wasn't playing along with the fantasy that the lake didn't belong to anyone. After the confrontation and the bizarre justification my neighbor gave for tearing down part of my fence, I knew I had to dig deeper into the property situation. Something about her certainty stuck with me. How confidently she insisted that the lake and its surrounding access points had always been shared. That wasn't just arrogance, it was rooted in something. Whether it was confusion, manipulation, or actual documentation, I had to find out. So I went digging through every file, document, and survey I had received during my purchase. Everything seemed clear-cut, at least at first. My property line was well defined in the documents I received when I bought the place. It stretched right up to the shoreline, fenced in for privacy, just like dozens of other lakefront homes I'd seen. The title, deed, and closing documents all confirmed the lot boundaries. Still, something was bothering me. If everything was so straightforward, why did she and half the neighborhood believe otherwise? That's when I decided to request a copy of the original subdivision plat from the city records office. It took a bit of time and more bureaucracy than I anticipated, but eventually I got my hands on the old maps and planning documents. That's where things got a little murky. The plat map was dated and hard to read. Several lines weren't clearly labeled, and it looked like whoever drafted it didn't bother to mark which areas were designated as public easements and which were private lots. There were faint notations that seemed to suggest pathways near the lake, but they were ambiguous at best. That ambiguity was all it took. I realized that the foundation of this so-called community access myth may have been born from these very maps. The vague markings and the lack of clarity had allowed people over the years to make assumptions. And once assumptions get passed down enough times, they start sounding like facts. I brought this map to a local planning office to get some clarification. The woman behind the desk squinted at it for a while before saying, "This is definitely outdated. The zoning's changed multiple times since this was issued." That got my attention. Changed zoning? That meant any long-held belief about access might not just be incorrect, it might be obsolete. I asked if there had ever been an official public easement through my property. After a few clicks and some internal documentation, she confirmed that there was no active easement registered. There may have been an informal path many years ago, but legally, nothing supported the idea of public access through my lot. That was a key moment for me. I realized how dangerous outdated information can be when it's never corrected. A map that hadn't been updated in decades had led multiple people to believe they had the right to walk through private property. Even worse, it gave people like my neighbor the perceived authority to act on those assumptions. No one had questioned the old maps, and the HOA hadn't done much to clarify boundaries. It was a breeding ground for misinformation. To make matters even more complicated, I discovered that there were two versions of the neighborhood covenants floating around. One was the original, drafted when the development was first built. The other was a revised version that had been selectively enforced. The original included general language about community enjoyment of the lake, but it didn't define access points or maintenance responsibilities. The newer version, however, explicitly stated that lakefront access was limited to designated easements and pathways, none of which ran through my land. That contradiction only added fuel to the confusion. The HOA hadn't bothered to formally retire the old version or distribute the new one properly, so people picked whichever clause suited their argument. My neighbor, of course, chose to ignore the updated document entirely. As far as she was concerned, the vague language in the original covenant gave her all the permission she needed. I started to understand how this misinformation had taken root and spread. No one bothered to verify it, and over time, those blurred lines on a map became the justification for cutting through fences and walking over private yards. Everyone just assumed the old ways were still valid because no one had told them otherwise. This wasn't just about a fence or a neighbor who couldn't respect boundaries. It was about decades of oversight, laziness, and poor documentation. The system had failed to clearly define what was public and what was private, and that failure had empowered people to believe they could take what wasn't theirs. The outdated maps didn't show ownership. They showed opportunity for those bold enough to misread them. After realizing how much misinformation was floating around the neighborhood and how outdated the maps were, I knew speculation wouldn't be enough. I needed hard proof, something irrefutable, something that couldn't be twisted by rumors or vague HOA rules. That's when I decided to hire a licensed land surveyor. It wasn't cheap, and it wasn't something I thought I'd ever need to do after purchasing what I believed was a clearly documented property. But with neighbors whispering about community access and one woman literally tearing down part of my fence, I needed more than closing documents and an old plat map. I needed a fresh, professional assessment of the exact boundaries of my land. I started by contacting a reputable surveying company that specialized in residential lakefront properties. After a few calls and some scheduling back and forth, I had a team scheduled to come out and do a full boundary survey. When they arrived, they brought high-precision GPS equipment, tripods, and tools I didn't recognize, which made me feel more confident that they were going to give me something solid and official. They were polite, thorough, and asked all the right questions. I showed them my original closing documents and title, along with the old and new subdivision maps I'd found. They spent hours walking the perimeter of my property, hammering stakes into the ground, marking corners with fluorescent flags, and using their equipment to measure the terrain with laser precision. I watched them working with quiet satisfaction. While others had opinions, these people were delivering facts. A few days later, I received a full report and a newly drawn survey map. It was clean, professional, and clear. The boundary lines left no room for debate. The fence I had installed was not just within my rights. It was precisely aligned with the actual property line. The land extended all the way to the water's edge, confirming that the shoreline directly in front of my home was privately owned by me, with no recorded easements, no shared access paths, and no public rights-of-way cutting through any portion of it. Armed with this new survey, I felt an enormous shift in confidence. No more second-guessing. No more wondering if maybe my neighbor had a point buried somewhere in that twisted argument of hers. I had proof, signed and stamped by a licensed surveyor, that not only validated my property lines, but completely debunked the myth of shared lake access in relation to my land. I made copies of the report and even had a few extra printed with the legal seal for anyone who wanted to challenge me. I wasn't trying to be aggressive. I just didn't want there to be any room left for confusion. One copy went straight into a folder for the HOA, just in case they decided to weigh in. Another went to my attorney, who I'd quietly retained just in case things escalated any further. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I was fully prepared for one if it came. When word got out that I'd had a professional survey done, the tone in the neighborhood changed slightly. Some people who had been cool toward me started keeping their opinions to themselves. A few others even came by and asked to see the report. I didn't mind showing it. It was public record, after all, and the look on their faces when they saw the official boundary line said it all. The myth had started to crack. Of course, the woman who started this whole thing wasn't happy. I could see it in the way she avoided eye contact or muttered under her breath when I passed her on the street. She knew she couldn't argue with a licensed survey. She didn't say much to me after that, but I could tell she still felt entitled to walk through my property. The difference now was that she knew she couldn't do it without consequences. Hiring that surveyor was one of the smartest decisions I made during the entire ordeal. It gave me clarity, security, and a strong position from which to defend my rights. It turned a messy situation filled with rumors and misinformation into a matter of legal fact. People could believe whatever they wanted, but belief doesn't change a boundary line. The survey didn't just settle the argument. It shifted the balance of power. I was no longer the outsider with a fence. I was the documented, verified owner of the entire stretch of shoreline behind my home. After I had the professional survey done and the new boundary lines confirmed, I thought the situation would naturally die down. I had legal documents, an official report with the surveyor's stamp, and the full backing of the property records to prove my case. But what I didn't expect was how quickly things would escalate once I started pushing back. I hadn't planned on taking legal action right away, but the damage to my fence was still unresolved, and the neighbor who caused it had made no effort to apologize, repair it, or even acknowledge wrongdoing. Instead, she doubled down, telling anyone who would listen that I was being difficult and that I was cutting the community off from their lake. It was frustrating, but it also revealed something deeper. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. It had become a coordinated narrative. She was actively trying to influence others in the HOA and around the neighborhood, spinning the story to make me look like the villain, someone who bought up a lakefront property just to wall everyone else out. What started as a fence dispute had turned into a targeted campaign of misinformation. That's when I realized it wasn't enough to just have the survey on my side. I had to take formal action. I started by documenting everything. I took pictures of the fence damage, screenshots of texts she had sent after our confrontation, and even recorded a few conversations with neighbors where she made false claims about my property lines. I kept copies of every letter I had received from the HOA, especially the ones that tiptoed around the issue, but clearly showed they were aware of what was happening. Once I had a solid collection of evidence, I sat down with a real estate attorney and laid it all out on the table. The attorney didn't hesitate. From a legal standpoint, this was a textbook case of property damage, trespassing, and defamation. More importantly, he pointed out that if I didn't act now, I could be inadvertently establishing a precedent. If people kept cutting through my property and I allowed it, even passively, they could eventually claim a prescriptive easement, meaning they could argue they had earned access over time through repeated, uncontested use. That possibility turned my frustration into urgency. My attorney sent a cease and desist letter to the neighbor first, demanding that she stop trespassing, spreading false claims, and making attempts to access my land. He included copies of the survey, property deed, and photographic evidence of the damage. We gave her a short window to respond before escalating. Predictably, she ignored the letter and instead fired off a dramatic email to the HOA, claiming she was being bullied and targeted by a new homeowner who didn't understand the values of the community. The HOA's response was lukewarm. They wanted to stay out of it, calling it a private dispute between neighbors. That was fine with me. I didn't need their permission to defend my property. So we filed a formal civil complaint for property damage and trespassing. It wasn't about the cost of the fence, though that was included. It was about establishing legally and publicly that my land was not up for debate. When the court date came, she tried to represent herself. She brought in copies of the old subdivision map and made wild claims about verbal agreements made years before I even moved into the neighborhood. She had no witnesses, no legal documentation, and no defense against the actual survey. When my attorney presented the stamped report, backed by GPS data and boundary markers, her entire argument crumbled. The judge didn't even need long to decide. He ruled in my favor and ordered her to pay for the damages and stay off my property permanently. What shocked me most wasn't just her lack of preparation. It was how genuinely shocked she looked when she lost. She truly believed she was in the right, that the vague memories of an old walking path and her belief in community access would somehow override legal boundaries and actual property law. But the courtroom doesn't work on belief. It works on evidence. That legal win did more than just repair the fence. It sent a message. Word spread quickly around the neighborhood that this wasn't just some boundary disagreement. It was now a matter of public record. A court had confirmed that the property was mine, access was restricted, and anyone attempting to test those lines could face the same consequences. Winning in court was a major relief, but what followed afterward was what truly shifted the entire dynamic between me, my neighbor, and the rest of the community. The final ruling wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a line drawn in permanent ink that no one could casually blur anymore. With legal clarity on my side, I moved forward to solidify my position even further. I didn't just want to defend what was mine. I wanted to make sure there was never another question about it. So I went back through the legal channels, spoke with a title expert, and reviewed the language in my deed again. That's when something interesting happened. While double-checking the documentation, the title expert pointed out that my lot included not just the land up to the lake, but a small triangular strip of the shoreline itself. This wasn't a technicality, it was a game changer. I asked what that meant in practical terms, and she explained that while the lake was open to general recreational use, ownership of the shoreline dictated who had the right to access it directly. In other words, if someone didn't own shoreline frontage, they couldn't legally step onto it without permission. That was a revelation. I'd always known I owned my yard and the fence and the stretch down to the water. But now I realized I owned the physical edge of the lake too. The shoreline others believed belonged to the community. My neighbor, and others like her, had always assumed the lake was neutral territory. But that wasn't the case. In this specific development, shoreline ownership transferred with the lot itself. Meaning, not only was I within my rights to stop her from walking through my yard, I could legally prevent anyone from stepping foot onto the shoreline portion in front of my property. The implications hit me all at once. That single strip of land essentially gave me control over lake access, at least on this side of the water. There were only a few properties in the neighborhood that actually touched the lake directly. The rest of the homes were set back, with no legal access points unless they were granted permission by a lakefront owner like me. The fence was just the beginning. Now I understood I had the power to make or break everyone else's access. I decided to get an updated survey map printed and certified with the shoreline explicitly marked. I added clear signage along the edges of my property, not to antagonize anyone, but to erase any possible confusion about where the private land ended and the public water began. The signs were polite, professional, and backed by legal enforcement. I even added a motion-activated security camera just to be safe. At first, the neighborhood was quiet. The usual passive-aggressive comments at HOA meetings stopped. The whispers and glances turned into silence. It seemed that once the court ruled in my favor and the new markers went up, the community realized this wasn't going to be one of those disputes that fades away after a few weeks. This wasn't just about me winning the conflict. It was about reshaping the narrative around who actually had control over the lake access that so many had taken for granted. But the biggest moment came when I attended an HOA board meeting a few weeks later. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a few updates about landscaping rules or noise complaints. But then one of the board members stood up and announced they were reviewing old easement claims to avoid future confusion about lake access. The entire room shifted in its seat. This wasn't just about me anymore. The HOA had finally acknowledged the issue publicly. After the meeting, a couple of my neighbors approached me, ones who had previously sided with my fence-destroying neighbor. They didn't exactly apologize, but they asked if I would consider letting them access the lake through my property again. This time, though, they were careful. They asked with respect. They didn't assume or demand. That was the difference. The power dynamic had changed. It was strange standing there, knowing that just a few months earlier I was being painted as the unreasonable newcomer. Now, people were approaching me not with entitlement, but with understanding. That little slice of shoreline had become a symbol of more than just private property. It was about clarity, accountability, and what happens when someone finally stands up and says no.